Господи, обереги наш дом, Господи. Господи, что все прошло мимо нашего дома. Господи, защити нас и огради, Господи.
The air raid sirens were not supposed to sound in Moscow. The darkness was not supposed to fall on the capital. For years, the Kremlin had cultivated a narrative of invulnerability, a shield of layered air defenses that made the heart of Russia an untouchable sanctuary. But on a night that will forever be known as the Black Friday operation, that narrative was shattered. Ukraine's drone strikes threw power supplies into disarray in Russian cities, a surgical, coordinated blow that tore through Russia's refineries, airfields, and Shahed launch sites. The message was clear, delivered not by diplomatic note, but by the shockwave of a precision strike. Putin wanted Ukraine to surrender. Well, Ukraine just sent him an answer, and it wasn't the one he was expecting. Moscow is in darkness. This is not a one-off instance. It is the new, terrifying reality for a regime that believed it could wage a war of annihilation without consequence. Russians are now getting a taste of the very same devastation that Ukraine has been facing for the last 3.5 years. For Putin, this could not be more humiliating. He has surrounded Moscow with a literal ring of layered air defenses, a multi-billion-dollar investment in national security theater. And yet, Ukrainian drones are still hitting deep inside, and he can't do anything to stop them. The instrument of this strategic humiliation is a new class of Ukrainian drone, a testament to the country's ingenuity under fire. Russia knew Ukraine was developing long-range drones, but it did not expect something this heavy, this accurate, or this survivable. This is not a repurposed hobbyist quadcopter. This is a sophisticated, long-range, one-way attack unmanned aerial vehicle, a product of a rapidly maturing domestic defense industry. This new generation of UAVs, often generically referred to by names like the Lutier, Fierce, or the FP-1, represents a paradigm shift in modern warfare. They are designed with advanced GPS guidance systems, anti-jamming capabilities, and a composite material construction that makes them incredibly difficult for conventional Russian radar to detect and track. With ranges extending well over 1,000 kilometers and significant warhead capacity, these drones have fundamentally altered the geometry of the war. They are the reason the coordinated, multi-region strike package tore through targets as disparate as the Saratov oil refinery, airfields in Luhansk and Donetsk, and the Saki air base that Russia spent years hardening. Ukraine just demonstrated a capability that forces Moscow to rethink the entire structure of its air defense network, a network now proven to be porous and ineffective against a determined, technologically advanced adversary. The sheer scale of the operation, hitting multiple high-value targets simultaneously, underscores a level of operational planning and technological sophistication that Russia simply did not anticipate. The strike on the Saratov oil refinery was the opening chord of a night that Russia will study for years. Located deep inside Russian territory, the refinery is a critical node in the Russian war machine's logistics chain, supplying fuel for its tanks, planes, and transport vehicles. When the drone hit, it was a strike not against a military base, but against the very economic engine that powers the invasion. Industry sources confirmed that the refinery, situated on the Volga River, was forced to halt primary oil refining operations following the drone attacks on November 1st. This is the essence of Ukraine's strategy: dismantle the war machine piece by piece by targeting the infrastructure that sustains it. The operation was a masterclass in strategic targeting, simultaneously hitting the fuel supply, the air bases used to launch attacks, and the drone depots where Russia prepares its own terror weapons. The goal is not to terrorize the Russian population, but to degrade Russia's capacity to wage war, making every sortie, every tank movement, and every missile launch exponentially more difficult and costly. This surgical precision stands in stark contrast to the indiscriminate terror tactics employed by the Kremlin. While Ukraine targets the fuel supply and the launch sites of the enemy's weapons, Russia continues its relentless, brutal campaign against Ukrainian civilians. The world has documented over 700 attacks on Ukrainian healthcare facilities since the start of the full-scale invasion, with hospitals, maternity wards, and children's clinics deliberately targeted and destroyed. In addition, hundreds of schools and educational institutions have been damaged or used for military purposes, aiming to destroy the future of the nation and terrorize children and parents. Russia's assault on energy infrastructure, thousands of missiles and drones, has caused mass blackouts, denying heat and water, and creating a severe humanitarian crisis, particularly during winter. These are not collateral incidents. They represent a systematic attempt to break the will of the Ukrainian people by destroying the very fabric of their society. The moral chasm between the two sides could not be wider. Russia strikes hospitals, schools, and civilian infrastructure to inflict maximum suffering, while Ukraine strikes oil refineries, airfields, and military logistics hubs to dismantle the infrastructure that enables aggression. Ukraine's actions are a strategic act of retribution, a necessary counterblow to protect its people by crippling the enemy's ability to wage war. The Kremlin's response to the Black Friday operation was a desperate, massive, yet ultimately futile counterattack. Russia used 653 drones and 51 missiles in a wide-reaching attack on Ukraine, a desperate attempt to prove its continued might. But the Ukrainian Air Force's defense was as effective as its offense. They shot down and neutralized 585 drones and 30 missiles. The sheer volume of the Russian attack, which triggered air raid alerts across Ukraine, only served to highlight the futility of their strategy. They are throwing vast quantities of outdated, easily neutralized weapons at a country that is not only defending itself with increasing skill, but is now striking back with devastating precision. The fact that Ukraine was able to neutralize such a massive wave of incoming fire while simultaneously executing a deep strike operation demonstrates a clear technological and strategic superiority. The success of the Ukrainian strike package has profound implications for the future of the conflict. For years, the Russian populace has been shielded from the true cost of the war, a psychological buffer that allowed the Kremlin to maintain a facade of normalcy. That buffer is now gone. When a heat and power station in the Moscow region is struck, triggering a major fire and cutting off heating for residents, the war is no longer a distant, televised event. It is a cold, dark reality in their own homes. This forces the Russian military command into an impossible dilemma. Either leave critical military and economic infrastructure exposed, or pull air defense assets from the front lines and occupied territories to protect Moscow and other deep targets. Every S-400 system redeployed to guard a refinery in Saratov is one less system protecting a military base in Crimea or a logistics hub near the front. This forced redeployment creates new vulnerabilities for Ukraine to exploit, accelerating the degradation of Russia's warfighting capability. This is the new reality they have to live in. The humiliation is complete. Putin, the man who promised to restore Russian greatness and secure its borders, has presided over the exposure of his capital's vulnerability. The ring of layered air defenses, the S-400s and Panzers, have been bypassed by a cheaper, more innovative, and more determined foe. The drones that hit the Saratov refinery, the airfields, and the power stations are not just weapons. They are a symbol of a crumbling, exposed regime. The psychological impact of the Moscow in Darkness event cannot be overstated. It breeds doubt, erodes confidence in the leadership, and brings the reality of the war home to the very people who have been most insulated from its consequences.
Охуеть, как там хуяли.
What you're looking at right now is not just a traffic jam. This is a snapshot of the Russian supply system brought to its knees. These trucks, stretching for kilometers, were never supposed to stop. They carry everything Russia needs to keep its regions moving: food, machinery, fuel, military equipment. And tonight, they're stranded in the middle of nowhere. Look closely at this footage. Dozens of drivers waiting beside their vehicles, engines off. Nothing to do but sit and hope. Some trucks haven't moved for hours, others for an entire day. And the reason is painfully simple. There is no fuel left to deliver to them. Putin demanded Ukraine's surrender, but Ukraine had a response, and it wasn't what he expected. Now Moscow is grinding to a halt. This isn't a one-time event. It's happening so frequently that even ordinary Russians are beginning to ask, is this the new normal? The answer is clear. For the past 3.5 years, Ukraine has endured relentless destruction, and now Russians are finally feeling the same chaos on their own soil. This is Russia's southern corridor, one of its busiest routes. Normally, fuel tankers refill these convoys constantly, but after a Ukrainian drone strike on a major refinery, the supply chain collapsed almost overnight. For the truckers, this isn't just an inconvenience. It's confusion, frustration, and a haunting realization that the war has finally reached their daily lives. It began with what seemed like a small adjustment, a fuel rationing regulation limiting diesel supplies for long-haul trucks to just a few hundred liters per refill. On paper, it sounded like a temporary wartime measure, simple, controlled, and necessary. In reality, it was the spark that lit the fuse beneath the entire economy. For a country that spans 11 time zones, where moving goods from one city to another often takes days of uninterrupted driving, such a cap doesn't just slow deliveries, it stops them entirely. A truck traveling between Moscow and St. Petersburg, the two beating hearts of the Russian economy, burns through more fuel than the new state-imposed limit allows. Everything beyond that distance, Siberia, the Arctic regions, the Far East, might as well be on another planet. On December 2nd, a Ukrainian drone strike targeted the Livny oil depot in Russia's Oriol region, hitting a critical node in the country's fuel infrastructure. Satellite imagery captured on December 6th, reported by Radio Svoboda, shows extensive damage at the facility, including the destruction of at least 2 major fuel storage tanks. Regional Governor Andrei Klitschkov confirmed that the strike caused a fire at several fuel and energy infrastructure facilities, highlighting the scale of the disruption. The impact of this strike is not limited to the depot itself. Russia's domestic transportation network, heavily reliant on fuel distribution from such key facilities, has been thrown into chaos. Long queues of trucks have formed along highways as drivers scramble to secure limited supplies, unable to complete deliveries across the vast distances of the Oriol region and beyond. The disruption extends to multiple sectors of the economy, slowing down logistics, delaying industrial production, and threatening supply chains in cities and remote towns alike. And as these trucks stopped, so did Russia. The images now circulating across social platforms tell the story better than any official report. Drivers leaning against their cabins, their arms crossed in defeat. Others pacing in frustration as their cargo spoils inside refrigerated trailers running low on power. Diesel pumps taped shut. Digital price boards frozen at numbers that no longer matter. Truckers who once spent their lives in motion now stranded in makeshift camps, boiling tea on portable stoves and waiting for answers that never come. These men and women were the invisible pillars holding up Russia's fragile economic architecture. They carried grain from the southern plains to northern ports. They delivered machine parts from Kaluga to the motor plants in Tolyatti. They supplied remote towns with medicine, coal, heating fuel, and spare parts that the rest of the world takes for granted. When they moved, Russia moved. When they stopped, every corner of the country felt the shockwave. But this crisis did not begin with a single regulation, nor with a single refinery running dry, nor with any one drone strike or border slowdown. The truth is far more complex and far more devastating. The Russian logistics network was already under enormous strain long before the fuel restrictions appeared. Years of sanctions had forced Moscow to reroute its entire import system through a handful of remaining partners. Every alternative route required longer distances, more fuel, more inspections, and more political risk. The supply chain became slower, heavier, and more expensive. Meanwhile, domestic refineries, aging and overstretched, operated at full capacity to feed both civilian consumption and the front lines of the war. When the Kremlin prioritized the military above all else, the civilian sector quietly absorbed the consequences. In the remote northern territories, those consequences are deadly. Most people outside Russia don't realize that more than half of the country is barely connected by paved roads. In these regions, the only viable transportation in winter is the Zimnik, temporary ice roads that stretch across frozen swamps, tundra, and rivers. They appear only during the coldest months and disappear as the ice melts in spring. These roads are lifelines for communities in the Arctic Circle, where temperatures plunge far below zero and cities depend on constant deliveries of coal, food, fuel, and emergency supplies. If a truck breaks down or runs out of fuel on these ice routes, there is no easy rescue. There are no nearby service stations, no shelters, no alternative paths. The Zimnik exists for a few weeks a year, and if those weeks are wasted, entire towns face shortages that last months. Heating systems run on coal that must be transported from thousands of kilometers away. Power plants in the far north rely on trucked diesel. Grocery stores survive on shipments timed with the winter road openings. Interrupting this flow isn't just a logistical inconvenience, it's a threat to human life. And yet, by redirecting fuel toward the war effort and limiting civilian access, the Kremlin knowingly choked off the very regions most vulnerable to disruption. Officials in Moscow framed the rationing as a patriotic sacrifice. But for the families in Yakutsk, Yamal, Norilsk, and the scattered mining towns across the tundra, these restrictions became something far more dangerous. Without fuel, the trucks cannot make the round trip from supply depots to remote settlements. Without trucks, no coal arrives. Without coal, heating plants shut down. In temperatures that can reach minus 50 degrees, this is not just a crisis, it is a catastrophe. Meanwhile, the political and economic heartlands, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kazan, Yekaterinburg, still show full shelves, bright lights, and busy streets. But behind this facade lies a slow unraveling. Shelves remain stocked only because inventory from previous months has not yet been depleted. Distribution centers are burning through reserves faster than they are being replenished. Supermarkets downplay delays and shortages to avoid panic. Regional officials hide supply numbers to protect their careers. Slowly, quietly, the backbone of the Russian consumer economy is bending under the pressure. While internal fuel policies strangled the domestic network, the routes connecting Russia to the outside world faced their own collapse. The western borders, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, once served as Russia's critical access points to European goods. Even under sanctions, certain categories of equipment, pharmaceuticals, and industrial components still pass through these gates under regulated exceptions. But over time, border inspections became tools of political leverage. Customs agents scrutinized every truck crossing into Russia, searching for dual-use items that could support the war. What once took half a day now took weeks. Truck drivers waited for up to 14 days in freezing temperatures, trapped in metal cabins with limited food and water. Engines ran constantly just to keep the vehicles warm, burning what little fuel remained. By the time many trucks reached Russian territory, their cargo had spoiled or degraded. The cost of transporting sensitive goods, medical equipment, specialized machinery, electronics tripled. Many European companies simply stopped sending anything eastward. With the West effectively sealed, the Kremlin turned to the east, relying on Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and China to keep the flow of goods alive. For a time, this worked, but as pressure increased from international sanctions, border authorities in Kazakhstan intensified inspections to avoid becoming a transit hub for embargoed items. Entire checkpoints transformed into bottlenecks, where thousands of trucks waited for clearance. Delays stretched from hours to days, then from days to weeks. Corruption surged. Some drivers paid bribes to move forward, while others slept in line as temperatures dropped and supplies dwindled.